The Japanese called it whispering death. Not whistling death, that was the Corsair. Getting these confused, as countless documentaries have done, as aviation programs with budgets larger than cents have done, is exactly how these aircraft got forgotten in the first place. The Bristol Beaufighter earned its name through sleeve valve engines that produced a characteristically muted sound during operation. When a Beaufighter came in low over the jungle canopy or across wave tops on an anti-shipping strike, its approach lacked the characteristic engine roar that gave defenders precious seconds of warning. The aircraft announced itself with the staccato thunder of 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6.303 Browning machine guns, by which point announcement was redundant. The F4U Corsair's whistling death? Entirely different. Air rushing through wing root oil cooler intakes during high-speed dives. Both nicknames entered popular consciousness through similar channels, part veteran memoir, part wartime propaganda, part journalistic embellishment. But conflating them represents a fundamental misunderstanding of where these aircraft fought and what they accomplished. And here's the uncomfortable truth that documentary after documentary has failed to acknowledge. While scholars and propagandists debated nickname origins, while cameras and reporters followed the photogenic Spitfire through its Battle of Britain glory, other aircraft held desperate defensive lines across theatres the newsreel crews never reached. They were dismissed as relegated to lesser theatres. But those theatres were only lesser because they lacked cameras, not because they lacked consequence. Nowhere was this more true than Malta. There exists a persistent fiction in popular aviation history. Certain fighters, the story goes, were relegated to secondary theatres because they couldn't compete in the European air war. The Hurricane was superseded by the Spitfire and sent abroad to fight less capable enemies. The Beaufighter was too unwieldy for daylight fighting and pushed to night operations and distant colonial campaigns. This narrative isn't merely incomplete, it's inverted. These aircraft didn't fight in Malta because they failed in Europe. They fought there because they were the only fighters available when that theatre ignited. And because the aircraft more precious to strategic planners, the Spitfire paramount among them, was hoarded for home defence, while an entire island starved under bombardment. Standard historical accounts mention Egypt and Crete, while saying nothing about Malta. Nothing. This omission isn't minor. It represents the excision of one of the most sustained and desperate fighter campaigns of the entire war. An island fortress that refused to fall. A population that starved rather than surrender. And the aircraft that held the line for 23 months while the fighters everyone wanted stayed home. Let's set the scene properly. Malta sits in the central Mediterranean, roughly 60 miles south of Sicily, roughly 200 miles north of the Libyan coast. A tiny archipelago, just 122 square miles of limestone rock, positioned directly athwart the supply routes connecting Italy to its North African armies. Whoever held Malta could interdict Axis shipping to Rommel. Whoever lost Malta would watch those convoys sail unmolested. The strategic calculus was brutally simple, and the Axis understood it perfectly. When Italy declared war on Britain on 10th of June 1940, Malta lay exposed with an air defence force that would have been inadequate for a minor raid, let alone a sustained siege. The Royal Air Force strength on the island at that moment consisted of exactly 4 Gloucester Sea Gladiator biplanes, retrieved from crates awaiting shipment. Aircraft that were obsolete before the war began, designed in the early 1930s. Open cockpits, fixed undercarriage, utterly outclassed by the Regia Aeronautica's modern Savoia Marchetti bombers and Fiat fighters. 4 biplanes, against an air force the Italians sent their best. The Regia Aeronautica dispatched Savoia Marchetti SM-79 Sparviero bombers, the Hunchback, as it was known, a distinctive three-engine aircraft that had proven itself in Spain and would prove itself again over Malta. Escorting them came Fiat CR-42 Falco biplanes and the more modern Macchi C-200 Saetta monoplanes. The CR-42 was technically a biplane like the Gladiator, but it was newer, faster, and flown by pilots who'd been training specifically for Mediterranean operations. The Italian fighter pilots who flew over Malta in those first weeks weren't second-rate. Some of them were veterans of the Spanish Civil War, experienced in combat flying that RAF pilots had never seen. 3 of the 4 Gladiators became operational and entered combat against these first Italian raids. Legend gave them names: Faith, Hope, and Charity. Whether those names were assigned officially, bestowed by grateful Maltese civilians, or invented by wartime journalists seeking a narrative, the historical record is genuinely unclear. The 3 Gladiators became symbols of Malta's determination to resist. The pilots who flew them knew the mathematics. Flight Lieutenant George Burgess, one of the handful of men who took these relics into combat, later described the experience of climbing toward formations of Italian bombers, escorted by monoplane fighters that could fly circles around his biplane. You climbed anyway. You attacked anyway. Because the alternative was watching those bombs fall on Valletta unopposed. The Gladiator's armament consisted of 4.303 Browning machine guns, 2 synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, 2 mounted beneath the lower wings. Against the SM-79's defensive armament and the self-sealing fuel tanks that Italian designers had begun incorporating, these rifle-caliber weapons often proved insufficient. Pilots reported hitting bombers repeatedly and watching them fly on, trailing smoke, but not falling. You expended your ammunition, you landed, you rearmed, you climbed again. And the bombers kept coming. They weren't going to win the battle for Malta. No military planner could have believed 3 obsolescent biplanes would hold against a sustained Italian air campaign. But they bought time. Days became weeks, and in the desperate mathematics of 1940, time was survival. Faith still exists. You can see her at the National War Museum in Valletta, serial number N5520, the only surviving Gladiator from that opening defence. She's smaller than you'd expect. The fabric covering shows the repairs, patches where ground crews stitched bullet holes, where riggers replaced entire panels shredded by Italian cannon fire. And when you stand in front of her, you understand something the documentaries rarely convey. The men who flew her were climbing into a death trap every single day and doing it anyway. The Hurricanes that replaced the Gladiators arrived in dribbles through the following months, flown off aircraft carriers, making dangerous dashes into the Mediterranean. These weren't the latest marks with improved performance. They were whatever could be spared from a Britain that expected invasion any day. Tropicalized variants, hastily fitted with sand filters that reduced performance. Battle-weary airframes transferred from squadrons that could afford to lose them. The powers that be sent Malta their leftovers and expected those leftovers to hold. But first, before Malta's Hurricanes, there was Greece. And before we understand what Malta's defenders accomplished, we need to understand what was lost in the Balkans, and who was lost. No single figure embodies the forgotten fighter phenomenon more completely than squadron leader Marmaduke Thomas St. John Pattle. Pat to everyone who flew with him. Born in South Africa in 1914, Pattle became the highest-scoring Western Allied ace of the entire Second World War, credited with approximately 51 confirmed victories before his death on the 20th of April, 1941. He scored more kills than any British, Commonwealth, or American pilot of the entire conflict. Yet while Spitfire aces like Wing Commander James "Johnny" Johnson became household names, knighted and celebrated in countless documentaries, Pattle remains virtually unknown outside specialist circles. The reason is geography. Pattle flew Gladiators and Hurricanes in the Mediterranean and Balkans, the forgotten theatres where cameras didn't follow. He achieved his first victories over Italian aircraft during the brief Greco-Italian War, demonstrating a natural gift for deflection shooting that pilots spend careers attempting to develop. His technique was methodical, almost scientific. He closed to ranges other pilots considered suicidal, sometimes inside 200 yards, where deflection errors mattered less and his fire was almost certain to strike. When Germany invaded Greece in April 1941, Pattle was already an ace many times over, commanding 33 Squadron and flying Hurricanes against overwhelming Luftwaffe strength. During the final desperate days of the Greek campaign, Pattle flew multiple sorties daily, while suffering from influenza, severe enough to have grounded any pilot in less critical circumstances. On April 20th, 1941, over the Bay of Eleusis near Athens, he engaged German Bf-110 twin-engine fighters while covering a withdrawal of British forces. Accounts of that final combat vary, but Pattle was last seen pursuing a 110 at low altitude, his Hurricane possibly hit by return fire before crashing into the sea. His body was never recovered. The destruction of RAF records in Greece during the evacuation meant that Pattle's precise victory tally can never be definitively established. Post-war researchers have credited him with as many as 51 kills, though some estimates run higher. What is certain is that he outscored Johnny Johnson's 38 victories, yet Johnson received a knighthood and appears in every Battle of Britain documentary, while Pattle has been erased from popular memory. Consider what this erasure reveals. The highest-scoring Western Allied ace of the war flew Gladiators and Hurricanes, the aircraft deemed second-rate. He fought in Greece and North Africa, the theatres deemed secondary. He died before the Spitfire arrived in significant numbers in the Mediterranean, before the cameras arrived to record victories for posterity. His story is the Hurricane story, writ in individual sacrifice. Present for the crisis, forgotten when the glory was distributed. Back to Malta, where the crisis was only beginning. The pilots flew Hurricanes against odds that would have seemed suicidal in any reasonable tactical assessment. During the height of the siege, Malta-based Hurricanes scrambled against Italian and German raids, outnumbered 5, 6, sometimes 10 to 1. The Luftwaffe had arrived in Sicily by January 1941, bringing Messerschmitt 109s that outperformed the Hurricane in almost every measurable parameter: speed, climb rate, ceiling. The Hurricane's advantage, and it had one, was its ability to turn inside the 109 at low altitude. Get a Hurricane below 10,000 feet in a turning fight, and the German pilot had a problem. But that required getting into a turning fight, which required surviving the initial bounce, which the 109 pilots made very difficult indeed. The Hurricane pilots engaged them anyway. They had no choice. Here's what rationing looked like on Malta during the siege. Ammunition was allocated per aircraft per sortie. Pilots learned to make every round count because there might not be more tomorrow. The standard Hurricane armament of 8.303 Browning machine guns gave approximately 14 seconds of firing time with full ammunition loads. But full loads were a luxury Malta couldn't afford. Pilots sometimes flew with 6 guns loaded, sometimes 4, conserving ammunition for the scrambles that might come tomorrow or the day after. Fuel was measured and hoarded. Aircraft sat grounded while ground crews calculated whether they had enough avgas for one more scramble. Aviation's spirit was so precious that some was diluted with lower-grade fuel, reducing engine performance in aircraft already outmatched. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that powered the Hurricane were designed for high-octane fuel. Running them on degraded mixtures increased wear, reduced power output, and shortened engine life. But engine life, measured in hundreds of hours, mattered less when aircraft life measured in days. And the civilians had it worse. By 1942, the population of Malta was surviving on less than 1,500 calories daily. The bread ration dropped to 10 ounces per day. Meat became a memory. The vegetables that Maltese farmers grew were requisitioned for the garrison. Mothers fed their children while going hungry themselves, and children went hungry anyway. The bombing was constant, not the sporadic raids that London endured, but systematic, sustained bombardment that made Malta the most heavily bombed place on Earth per square mile. Entire streets in Valletta ceased to exist. The three cities across the Grand Harbour, Vittoriosa, Senglea, Cospicua, were reduced to rubble. Churches that had stood for 4 centuries collapsed under German bombs. The people retreated underground, living in the ancient catacombs and railway tunnels and natural caves that honeycomb Malta's limestone. They emerged to work, to queue for rations, to watch the hurricanes scramble. Then they went back underground when the sirens wailed again. And still the island held. In April 1942, King George VI awarded the George Cross to the entire island of Malta. Not to an individual, not to a regiment, to the civilian population and military garrison collectively. The citation spoke of heroism and devotion that would long be famous in history. It was the only time the George Cross was awarded to an entire population. The announcement was made while the bombing continued, while the starvation continued, while hurricanes that should have been replaced months earlier continued scrambling against raids they couldn't possibly defeat. But here's the question that haunts this period. The question that gets asked in hushed tones at air shows and in the back pages of aviation forums. Where were the Spitfires? The answer is straightforward, rarely spoken aloud in mainstream accounts, but straightforward nonetheless. The Spitfire stayed home. Fighter Command and the Air Ministry regarded the Spitfire as too valuable, too scarce, and too strategically vital for home defence to risk in the Mediterranean. While Malta's Hurricanes were dying in the air over Grand Harbour, Spitfires flew standing patrols over southern England against German attacks that had diminished to nuisance raids. The daylight blitz had ended. The night bombing campaign was winding down. Spitfires sat in dispersals across southern England, waiting for an invasion that was never going to come, while Malta burned. The strategic logic was defensible, barely. The Spitfire was a precision instrument, designed for the temperate British climate, dependent on sophisticated maintenance and quality fuel. Deploying it to a besieged island with cratered runways, improvised servicing, and uncertain supply seemed wasteful. Better to preserve it for home defence and send the rugged, repairable Hurricane to hold the Mediterranean. Except the Mediterranean was where the war's outcome was being decided, and Malta's defenders were dying while the aircraft that could have saved them stayed home. Spitfires finally reached Malta in March 1942, nearly 2 years after the siege began. The delivery mechanism testified to how critical the situation had become. The American aircraft carrier USS Wasp made multiple runs into the Mediterranean specifically to launch Spitfires within range of the island. Operation Calendar in April 1942 delivered 47 Spitfires. Within hours, most of them had been destroyed. German reconnaissance had detected the delivery. Luftwaffe bombers caught the Spitfires on the ground, refueling, many with pilots still in debriefing. The ground crews hadn't yet learned the rhythms of Malta, the need to disperse immediately, to refuel under camouflage, to assume attack was imminent because it always was. The aircraft that was supposed to turn the tide became burning wreckage alongside the cratered runways. It was a catastrophe that nearly broke Malta's defenders, not because they'd lost the battle, but because they'd finally been given hope and watched it burn. A second WASP operation in May 1942, Operation Bowery, succeeded where the first had failed. 64 Spitfires reached Malta, and this time the defenders were ready. Ground crews had learned from April's disaster. Aircraft were dispersed immediately upon landing, refueled in protected revetments, rearmed and ready to scramble within minutes. When the Luftwaffe came for this delivery, they found Spitfires waiting. The tide turned. But by that point, the Hurricanes had held Malta for 23 months against the combined air forces of two Axis powers. 23 months. Outgunned, outnumbered, fighting with what they had because what they needed stayed home. And Malta didn't fall. One pilot, above all others, came to embody Malta's air war after the Spitfires finally arrived. George Frederick Berling was a Canadian, 20 years old when he reached the island in June 1942, already a decorated pilot, but not yet the legend he would become. Within 4 months, flying Spitfires over Malta's tortured skies, he would claim 27 confirmed victories and become the island's highest-scoring ace. They called him Screwball. The nickname captured something essential about the man: his unconventional approach to aerial combat, his almost obsessive study of deflection shooting, his willingness to engage enemies at ranges other pilots considered suicidal. Berling didn't just shoot at enemy aircraft, he calculated. The mathematics of deflection shooting defeated most fighter pilots. When you fire at an aircraft crossing your nose, you have to lead the target, aim where it will be when your bullets arrive, not where it is when you pull the trigger. The amount of lead depends on crossing speed, range, and the velocity of your rounds. Most pilots learned rough rules of thumb. 1 wingspan lead at this distance, 2 at that. Berling wanted precision. He'd spent hours analysing gun camera footage, working out the exact angles and lead distances required to hit a target crossing at specific speeds. The Spitfire's reflector gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass plate in front of the pilot, a central dot surrounded by a ring. The ring was calibrated for a specific target wingspan at a specific range. Adjust the wingspan setting for your target, wait until the enemy aircraft's wingtips touched the ring, and your bullets would arrive at the right place. In theory. In practice, pilots often ignored the ranging feature entirely, spraying ammunition in the general direction of targets and hoping for hits. Berling used the gun sight as its designers intended, calculating deflection with the mechanical precision of a mathematician. His preferred engagement range was inside 200 yards, where deflection errors mattered less, and the density of his fire pattern was devastating. At that range, a half-second burst from the Spitfire's two 20mm Hispano cannons and 4.303 Brownings could saw a wing off. The Hispano cannons themselves were temperamental beasts in the early Spitfire marks that reached Malta. The drum-fed variants jammed frequently. The vibration of combat maneuvering could jostle rounds out of alignment, and the mechanism would seize mid-burst. Berling learned to fire in short, precise bursts rather than holding the trigger down, reducing the stress on the feed mechanism and conserving ammunition for the kills that mattered. His logbook from Malta reads like a catalogue of destruction, victory after victory recorded in his cramped handwriting while the siege reached its crescendo around him. On July 27, 1942, Berling shot down 4 enemy aircraft in a single sortie. Bf-109S, Macchi C-202S. It didn't seem to matter what he faced. The Macchi was arguably the finest Italian fighter of the war, a sleek monoplane that could match the Spitfire in most performance parameters. In other hands, it was a deadly opponent. In Berling's sights, it died like everything else. But Berling's story also illustrates the human cost of Malta's defence. In October 1942, he was evacuated from the island after being wounded. A cannon shell fragment to the heel, burns, exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. The bomber carrying him home was shot down over the Bay of Biscay. Berling survived, rescued from the water, but 2 other Malta aces on the same aircraft didn't. Even leaving the island could kill you. Berling survived the war, but not the peace. He died in 1948, attempting to fly a transport aircraft to Israel during that country's War of Independence. His Nordine Norseman crashed on takeoff from Rome. He was 26. The highest-scoring Canadian ace of the Second World War, forged in Malta's skies, dead before he turned 30. His name should be as famous as any Battle of Britain pilot's. It isn't. He flew over Malta, not Kent. The siege didn't end with a surrender or a decisive battle. It ended with logistics, specifically with a convoy that became the most famous maritime operation in the Mediterranean War. Operation Pedestal, launched in August 1942, was Britain's attempt to break Malta's starvation once and for all. 14 merchant ships sailed from Gibraltar, escorted by a fleet that included 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. The largest convoy escort of the war. And still, the Axis nearly stopped it. The convoy entered the Mediterranean on August 10, 1942, and almost immediately came under attack. German and Italian submarines stalked the formation from the moment it passed Gibraltar. On August 11th, the German submarine U-73 found an opening. The aircraft carrier HMS Eagle had served since 1924, an old ship by carrier standards, but she'd been launching fighters for convoy protection throughout the Mediterranean War. U-73's torpedoes struck her port side in quick succession, 4 hits in the space of seconds. The carrier rolled over and sank in 8 minutes, taking 131 of her crew with her. The surviving sailors scrambled into the water as their ship capsized, watching the destroyers race to rescue them while the convoy steamed on. It couldn't stop. Stopping meant death for everyone. The air attacks began the following day as the convoy entered range of Axis airfields in Sardinia and Sicily. Junkers Ju-88s came in at wave-top height, launching torpedoes that tracked through the formation. Savoia Marchetti bombers dropped their loads from altitude, while Italian fighters strafed the decks of merchant ships, whose defensive armament consisted of machine guns manned by merchant sailors who'd never expected to fight a war. The cruiser Cairo took a torpedo hit on August 12th and had to be scuttled, her crew rescued, her wreck left to sink while the convoy pressed on. The cruiser Manchester was torpedoed that same night, her captain ordering abandon ship after flooding proved uncontrollable. 9 merchant ships were sunk in those terrible days, their cargoes of food and fuel and ammunition going to the bottom of the Mediterranean instead of to the starving island they'd been meant to save. But 5 ships made it through. The tanker Ohio became the symbol of Operation Pedestal's desperate determination. An American-built vessel crewed by British merchant sailors, Ohio carried 11,000 tons of aviation fuel, enough to keep Malta's fighters flying for weeks. She was hit by bombs, by torpedo, by the wreckage of a crashing German aircraft that embedded itself in her deck. Her steering gear failed, her engine room flooded. By 13th of August, she couldn't steam under her own power. The destroyers Penn and Bramham lashed themselves alongside the crippled tanker, their hulls grinding against hers, and physically dragged her toward Malta. The minesweeper Rye took over when the destroyer's fuel ran low. For 2 days, this improvised formation crept toward Grand Harbour at 3 knots. Ohio riding so low in the water her decks were awash, her crew still fighting fires and manning pumps, while every man aboard knew that one more bomb hit would turn 11,000 tons of aviation fuel into an inferno. She reached Malta on the 15th of August 1942, the Feast of the Assumption, the Feast of Santa Maria. The Maltese came out to the harbour walls to watch the surviving ships limp in. Ohio was little more than a hulk by then, her upperworks burned and twisted, her hull buckled. They beached her in the harbour and pumped out her cargo, and Malta's aircraft had fuel for the first time in months. The convoy arrived on a feast day, and the Maltese have never forgotten. They call it the Santa Maria convoy now. Every 15th of August, they remember the ships that made it and the ships that didn't, the sailors who died bringing food to an island that refused to surrender. With Malta's survival secured, the island transformed from besieged fortress to offensive base. And here's where the Beaufighter returns to the story, not yet in the Pacific, but in the Mediterranean, where it belonged to Malta's narrative. From late 1942 onwards, Bristol Beaufighters operated from Malta's airfields on a mission that would help decide the entire North African campaign, hunting Rommel's supply ships. The Desert Fox was a logistical nightmare for the Axis. His Africa Corps consumed fuel and ammunition at prodigious rates, and every bullet, every gallon of petrol had to cross the Mediterranean from Italian ports. The convoys ran at night when they could, hugging the coastline, hoping to avoid detection. They couldn't avoid Malta. Beaufighters, armed with torpedoes and cannon, stalked those convoys in the darkness. The aircraft's sleeve valve engines, the same acoustic signature that earned the Whispering Death nickname in the Pacific, made them difficult to detect on approach. The torpedo attack profile was precise and unforgiving. Approach at wave-top height, no higher than 60 feet, at speeds around 180 knots. Drop too high and the torpedo would break up on impact. Drop too fast and it would porpoise wildly, missing its target. Drop too close and you'd fly through the explosion of your own success. Ship's lookouts, scanning for aircraft, heard nothing until the Beaufighter was already in attack position. Then came the torpedo splashes. Then came the cannon fire raking the decks. 4 20-millimetre Hispanos pumping shells into bridge structures and anti-aircraft positions. Then came the secondary explosions as fuel and ammunition went up. Number 227 Squadron, RAF, Number 39 Squadron, RAF, and others flew anti-shipping strikes from Malta throughout 1942 and 1943. The tonnage they sank can be measured in statistics. Thousands of tons of supplies that never reached Rommel. But the strategic effect was larger than any number captures. The Africa Corps was starved of fuel while fighting a mobile war that consumed fuel by the tanker load. Rommel's logistics officers calculated they needed a minimum of 30,000 tons of supplies per month. Some months they received a quarter of that. El Alamein was won in the Mediterranean as much as in the desert. Those Beaufighter crews, flying at night over dark waters, navigating by dead reckoning, attacking ships that shot back with everything they had, rarely appear in the documentaries. The aircraft they flew weren't photogenic enough. The theatre they served in wasn't dramatic enough. But they strangled an army, and that army broke. What happened at Malta could be told about Burma, about Ceylon, about everywhere the empire caught fire before the prestige aircraft arrived. The pattern was identical. Hurricane squadrons scrambling against superior enemies, holding lines they weren't designed to hold, fighting with obsolescent equipment because the modern equipment was needed elsewhere. The Hurricane served in France, Norway, North Africa, Malta, Ceylon, Singapore, India, the East Indies and Burma. Everywhere the war was desperate, and nowhere the cameras followed. By the time Spitfires reached Burma in significant numbers in 1944, the worst of the fighting was over. The Hurricane had borne it. The same people who built Airfix Hurricanes as children and read Biggles novels where the hero flew something rugged and workmanlike against impossible odds. They grew up watching documentaries that mentioned the Hurricane in passing before spending 45 minutes on the Spitfire. They knew something was wrong with that story. They just couldn't articulate what. Here it is, articulated. The aircraft dismissed as second-rate were, in operational reality, the first-line defenders of empire at its most desperate. They weren't relegated to lesser theatres because they were lesser fighters. They were deployed to those theatres because they were the only fighters available, and because the aircraft deemed superior stayed home, protecting an England that no longer faced invasion. Malta's Hurricanes held for 23 months before the Spitfires arrived. The island's gladiators, fabric-covered biplanes against modern fighters, held before the Hurricanes arrived. The Beaufighters that hunted Rommel's convoys did work the Spitfire couldn't have done, wouldn't have been risked for, and never received credit for. The siege of Malta was won by aircraft the cameras didn't follow, flown by pilots the newsreels didn't film, over an island the historians treated as a footnote. Their names aren't household words. Their aircraft don't dominate museum collections. Their stories don't fill 2-hour documentaries. Marmaduke Pattle outscored every Spitfire ace and died forgotten. George Berling became the deadliest pilot over Malta and died at 26. The men who flew gladiators against bomber formations knew the mathematics and climbed anyway. This is the story the Spitfire mythology obscures. Not that the Spitfire was overrated, it wasn't. It was a magnificent aircraft. But the aircraft that held the line while Britain decided whether to send it were magnificent too. And they've been waiting 80 years for someone to say so. The Whispering Death earned its name in theatres the Spitfire never saw. The Hurricane held lines the Spitfire never reached. Faith, hope and charity climbed against odds the Spitfire was never asked to face. Malta still remembers. Someone else should too. Subscribe for more stories like this.